Hello and welcome to this episode of 10 Meter Tuners. My name is Kobe. Today we're going to be talking about using sight riser blocks like these on your Olympic rifles. So from my experience as a competitive rifle shooter and as a rifle team manager, I've noticed that one of the first things that a lot of people will do when they begin customizing their Olympic rifles will be to add a set of sight risers like these. Now, for the most part, sight risers can benefit most shooters, but I think it's important that we understand their function and some of the advantages and disadvantages to using these sight risers. Okay, so let's take a look at sort of the fundamentals of what sight risers are. So, sight risers will usually come in a set. There's a smaller riser for your front sight and a longer riser for your rear sight, but they are the same vertical height. There's a male dovetail machined into the top that interfaces with the dovetail on the bottom of your front sight or your rear sight, and there's a female dovetail cut into the bottom that'll interface with the dovetail machined into your barrel shroud or your receiver. So nowadays, most Olympic rifle manufacturers will include a set of risers when their rifle ships from the factory. So if you buy a brand new rifle, you should have a set of sight risers to use out of the box. That being said, if your gun doesn't have a set of sight risers, just know that on a well thought out Olympic rifle, you shouldn't need a set of sight risers to properly zero the sights. It may not be as comfortable to use as if you had sight risers, but you should still be able to aim down your sights, zero them, and use the rifle. Okay, so I have two different rifles set up to sort of demonstrate the benefits of using risers. So first gun I have is my On-Shoots 1903. This is my smallbore rifle. So if I look at how the sights are set up on this gun, I have them mounted directly to the receiver and to the barrel shroud. There are no sight risers being used on this rifle. I can zero the sights, I can bring the rifle into position and aim down the sights, but when I really just try to relax and have the rifle in a resting position, I can see that, these sights are really far away from my aiming eye, my left eye. So there's a few things that I can do. I can bring my head to the rifle like this, but that results in me having to move my head to the sights, or I can roll the rifle like this to bring the sights in closer to my eye. This is what we call canting the rifle. Now there are certain instances where canting the rifle can actually be beneficial to you. For shorter shooters, canting the rifle is actually a way to distribute the weight of the barrel sort of closer to your center of gravity, but we can talk about that later. The point is that if I were to just bring my rifle up to a resting position, I can't aim down my sights without physically altering my position to look down the sights. I'd either have to bring my head to the sights or bring the sights to my head. By comparison, I have this rifle. This is my 8002. It is an air rifle. And on this rifle, I have a set of the Tecro risers installed. So we can see that they give me a slight vertical elevation, and then they're offset to the right side so that they bring the sights closer to my aiming eye. let's talk about offsetting the sights real quick. So if I'm to bring the rifle up like this, we can see that the front sight is already covering my left eye. It's very close to my aiming eye. On a rifle that doesn't have offset sights like the 1903, if I bring the rifle up, the sights are far away from my aiming eye. So by using an offset, this eliminates me from having to roll my head into the gun to gain sort of this sight picture. All I do is I bring the rifle up, bring it over my support arm, and I am already in my aiming position. So if we look at it from the side, I have a little bit of downwards pressure to get my cheek weld and to stabilize the rifle, but I'm not doing anything like having to count the rifle to look down the sights or having to roll my head to look through the sights. In rifle, we have the luxury of using accessories like these. And of course, the objective of our sport rifle is to be as consistent as we possibly can. Part of being consistent is being able to get into the position a number of times and have everything be the same every time we look down the sights. So by eliminating something like having to count the gun or roll our heads, this sort of adds to our repeatability. Now all I have to worry about is looking down the sights and being sure that everything is still when I take my shot and that I have a good sight picture. Now I want to talk about some of the different options that we have for riser blocks. Okay, so let's talk about some of the different type of risers you may see. At the very basic level, we have risers like these. These are just squares. They're made by 10.9. Pretty self-explanatory how they work. They fit underneath your rear sight, and then you can slide them on to the top of your receiver. Another common type of riser would be these. These work similarly to the lasso ends. The only thing is that they're a lot higher. These ones are made by Onshoots, and I believe that Onshoots is shipping a set of these with all of their 9000 series air rifles. So if we mount them to our sights, same as the last time. What's interesting about these is that they have this flared edge on it. So if we need to, we can use that to mount our sights more forward or more over the chamber where no rail previously existed. Alternatively, we can flip it around like this and then use the flared edge to pull our sights back towards our face. Of course, if you have multiple sets of these, and this goes for any set of risers, you can stack them on top of one another to gain more vertical distance. Another common type of riser you'll find would be something like these. These are made by Techro. We can see that they're made out of several pieces. There's a base, a set of silver pillars, and then the top rail. These ones are set up with an offset, and when we look at it taken apart, you can see that this is the base. There are several holes drilled into it, so we can use that to mount the top rail either in line or offset to the left or to the right, depending on what we need. If you need more vertical distance, you could use a higher pillar like this one, and you can actually purchase a set of them like these. Of course, if you don't need that distance, then there's a pillar that'll allow you to mount it directly to the base. Here's another set. So it's just like the tech rolls, except I think these are made by Sentra. So we can see same idea. There's holes that will allow you to offset it to the left or to the right. Top rail, pillars, and of course, if you don't have enough pillars, you can use just a regular riser and stack it like that. To add some variety to this list, I've included these. These are also made by Onshoots, but we can see that they're not the same height. So if you take off these screws, you can actually adjust the vertical distance of these risers. And it's nice because they have this tongue, so if we really needed it, we could use it to mount our sights over our chamber or more rearboard, depending on our needs. Also, we have a set of these. These are made by Sentra. I think they're called the tracks, but we can see that the top rail can be offset to the left or to the right, and we just slide it on this track, and we can use this to fine-tune our windage. This would be like a really big riser. This is a chamber bridge. So this is off of a Walther KK500, but we can see that if we mount it to the receiver, there's this large piece of rail that bridges the top of our chamber, and of course, without it, there's no rail. These parts of it are cut so that you can load your ammo, or you can eject your shells wherever you need. This is an example of a front sight that's set up on top of a combination of risers. So we can see it's offset. It has this regular square riser block and then the sight. These are sight riser shims, so we can see that they're very low. So if we just need a little bit of elevation, we can use these. What I like to use them for is in disciplines where we know that we're going to be shooting at different distances, such as NRA prone. So let's say that I'm transitioning between my 50-yard target and my 100-yard target. I know that I'm going to have to crank my sights up to gain more elevation. But what I can do is add a small set of risers like these in between my sights, so that way I have to crank my elevation a little bit less. So when we're talking about sight risers, we also need to understand how our sights work. So I've drawn a diagram to try and explain this. Forgive me, I know that the drawing is a bit crude, but let me explain. So on this side of the drawing, we have our target. This is our paper, and this circle is our bullseye, what we're shooting at. On this side of the drawing, we have the shooter. He is holding his rifle in the standing position, and we have a right triangle that is drawn on this picture. This is very important to understand. So on the bottom of the triangle, we have this blue line. It runs from his chamber in a straight line all the way to the center of our bullseye. For this video, I'm going to consider that to be the trajectory of our shot. In real life, this is not how our projectile is traveling. It's actually traveling in an arc. But for simplicity's sake, for this video, I'm going to pretend that it's traveling in a straight line like a laser beam. Over here, we have a small green line that starts from this blue line, and it runs to the center of his rear sight. Connecting to that green line, we have a red line. This is our hypotenuse. So it connects from the top of the green line to the center of the bullseye, and it intersects with the trajectory of our shot. This concept is very important to understand. Okay, so I have a similar diagram to the one that I had before. So we have the target and we have the shooter. Just like before, we have this triangle that's created between the trajectory of our shot, the height of our rear sight from the center of our chamber, and the line that is created between our front and rear sight that intersects at the bullseye. Now, what we really need to pay attention to is where this yellow line and the orange line intersect. We want it to be at the bullseye. This sort of example is a really ideal situation where we're the same height as the target. In actuality, if we're taller or shorter, we may have an image that looks like this or an image that looks like this. But the point is that this line that's created between our front and our rear sight must always intersect with the shot trajectory on the bullseye. Now, I've created a couple of examples, and these are a bit extreme, but I think it gets the point across. So if we look at this, and we're looking through our front sight using our rear sight, we can see that in this example, the rear sight is much higher than our front sight. This causes our shot trajectory to land above our bullseye, and we don't want that to happen. In this example, we have our rear sight lower than our front sight, and this is causing our shot trajectory to land below our bullseye. So we also don't want that. We need to have our rear sight just slightly higher than our front sight so that we can create this intersection point at whatever distance we're shooting at. So either 10 meters, 50 meters, 50 feet, 50 yards, 100 yards, whatever your discipline is. When we use the risers, we don't need to use different riser block heights to get this elevation, because we have to remember that our rear sight is adjustable. And within this area of adjustability inside of our rear sight, we should have enough room to create this height difference. And these photos are a very exaggerated example. This angle is not as extreme in real life. It's very, very, very small. So something important to remember when we're talking about shooting at distance, the line that we create that runs between our front and rear sight, this will always be running straight. The trajectory of our shot, however, depending on our projectile, so I'm thinking in terms of 22 LR, it won't always be going in a straight line. There's going to be a certain point where the shot is traveling and it loses velocity and begins to arc down. At this point, where the shot arcs down, this straight line that's created by the alignment of our front and rear sight will intersect it at some point. Now that we understand how our front and rear sights work in relationship to the trajectory of the shot, let's talk about some fundamentals of how our rear sight works and how we can use riser blocks to fine-tune our rear sight. So what I have here is just a typical rear sight. This is a Tecro. We can see that there's a couple parts. We have our windage knob, our elevation knob, a metal housing that holds these knobs, and in the center of the housing we have a threaded holder for our iris. I'm going to call this our iris holder. If we look at slightly different sight, see that it has all of the same parts except it doesn't have this metal holder. So I like this because we can actually see how it works. So we can see that on our vertical adjustment, our up and down, we have a slide that moves in the vertical direction. So if I crank the sight down, we can see that this entire piece that our iris holder is mounted to is moving down. We have our lateral adjustment, so if we crank it to the right, see that our iris holder moves responding to the direction we crank the knobs. So in an ideal world, after you zero your rifle, your iris holder will be located in the center of your housing, or at least in this case in the center of this window within the housing. So I've tried to draw a similar diagram on the board. So again, this black area is our housing, our window. This green would represent our iris holder, and it can go up, down, left, and right. Typically, when you buy your sights, when they're brand new from the factory, this iris holder will be somewhere in the center of your housing or within your window of adjustment. After we zero our sights, we may need to move it up or down or more to the left or more to the right in order to create this angle with our front sight to get this intersection point between our line of sight and the trajectory of our shot. So I'm going to make a theoretical example. So imagine that this is another sight. So we're shooting and our shots are landing at the 6 o'clock position, so they're going down. So what I'm going to do is adjust my iris holder upwards. I'm going to be cranking my sights to give myself more elevation. The more and more I crank my sights up, the higher this holder will get within the window of adjustment. Eventually, when I get to the top, I'm not going to be able to adjust this holder to go upwards anymore. I'm going to run out of clicks. And if you run out of clicks, you're stuck, because you just can't go up anymore. And forcing your sights to go past the area that they stop isn't going to help your problem. It's only going to make it worse. You'll break your sights if you do that. So what can I do to give myself more vertical clicks? Because that's what I need. We know that this iris holder has to stay in this position, because that's creating this angle with our front sight. So what we can do is to move our entire adjustment window upwards. Now, how do we do that? Well, if we have another riser block like this, we can slip it underneath our rear sight, and now our entire metal holder will be pushed upwards, upwards away from the center of our barrel. So again, this stays in the same place, but if we add this riser block, our entire holder will be pushed upwards. And now I have regained this area that I can use to adjust my sights up. The same idea can be applied if your sights are maxed out to the left or to the right. This is less common than maxing your sights out upwards or downwards, but it can happen if you're using something like a bloop tube or a sight extension that hasn't been indexed on your barrel. So I'm shooting and I run out of clicks to go left, but I know that I need to go more to the left. What I can do is that if I have a sight a sight riser like this that moves laterally, I can put it underneath this this sight and move it more to the left. That'll adjust my entire housing to the left while keeping this in the same place. So let's say that I offset it. I now have the room to go to my left, should I need more clicks in that direction. And I have an equal amount of clicks in the opposite direction. Something I neglected to talk about earlier is how we can use sight risers to adapt different accessories to fit our rails. Each rifle manufacturer will use their own proprietary sized dovetail. As an example of adapting an accessory, let's say that we have an on-shoots front sight and we're trying to fit this onto our fine work bow rifle. And we have purchased a set of fine work bow sized Tecro risers. If I try to fit the on-shoots front sight onto the fine work bow dovetail, this will not fit. The fine work bow dovetail is wider than the on-shoots dovetail. If we look at these risers, you can see that they're marked with an F for fine work bow. Of course, when you buy these online, they should come, they should have the size of dovetail in the product description. If I look at this, this has an A on it. This is marked for on-shoots, so it'll fit the on-shoots front sight. Because this fine work bow base and this on-shoots top are both made by Techro, they will fit together like this. So what I can do is fit the on-shoots top plate onto the fine work bow base, and then fit my on-shoots front sight onto the on-shoots adapter, and now I will be able to use this on-shoot sight on my fine work bow base, and I can put this onto my fine work bow rifle. So this is just about wrapped up all of the reasons why you may consider purchasing sight risers. Now I would like to talk about why we may opt not to purchase a set of sight risers. So the first thing that comes to my mind is price. And like anything else in rifle, risers are going to be expensive. In front of me there's about $1,100 of sights and risers. If you're just starting out, I recommend purchasing a set of these. These are just these very plain square risers. There's not a lot of features on them, but they do give you this vertical offset. Typically you can find these for around $50 to $60 online. If you have a slightly bigger budget, then I would go for something like these Techros, where they use a pillar system and you can do a lateral offset. These can be had for about $95 online. Of course, if you want different options for heights, then you'll have to buy a distance kit on top of the sight risers. These can run for about $50 per set. The more features your risers have, the more expensive they'll be. I've seen risers that run for an upwards of $250 for a set. The next thing I think that we need to think about is how practical it is to use sight risers in our discipline. Part of this is knowing the rules. For example, in 10-meter air rifle, we are allowed to have a maximum of a 60mm vertical offset from the center of our barrel to the center of our front sight. So this distance. So even if you own like 100 millimeters worth of sight risers, you'll only be able to use 60 of them. Of course, in other disciplines like small bore, I don't believe that there is a limit on how high you can have your sights. The accessories that a standing shooter will need will be different than the accessories a prone shooter will need. So for me, on my standing rifle, I use a set of risers. Like I showed earlier, that's because when we shoot in standing, we shoot with the size of our body squared off to our target, like this. And when I try to bring the barrel in line with my aiming eye, this can be really difficult because my body is in the way, and in this case, having this lateral offset with my sights can greatly help me to eliminate any unnecessary straining of the head. On the other hand, this is an air rifle that I use to practice shooting in prone. And when I shoot in prone, I don't use any risers. One, because I want my eye to be as close to the barrel as possible, but also because when I aim a prone rifle, the rifle is going forward of my body, so my chest isn't in the way of moving the rifle in front of my face. So when I'm like this, the barrel is actually very much in line with my aiming eye, and I don't have to bend it as much as I would in standing. While I'm on the topic of prone, if your shooting discipline involves you shooting at different distances, like shooting at 50 yards and then going to 100 yards, having an offset, a lateral offset, will mean that as you transition distances, on top of having a elevation adjustment between each distance, you will have a lateral adjustment. And depending on the shooter, they may or may not want that. I know for myself, I wouldn't want that, because that's just one more thing that I have to worry about in the middle of a competition. Of course, if you can afford to purchase several sets of sights and just change them out at each distance, then this problem is pretty much eliminated. One more thing that I think is worth mentioning is how riser blocks can affect the way we hold the rifle and our balance point. So what do I mean by this? When I hold the rifle and I'm using riser blocks, I can afford to have a very low support arm position because the center of the sights are in line with my aiming eye. If I didn't have sight risers and the center of my sights are mounted lower, holding the rifle like this would mean that I'd have to bring my head down to the sights, and that's not something that I want to do. For me, the way that I would correct this would be to have a different sort of hold on the rifle, and also to bring my support arm back. This would allow me to get some elevation and prevent me from bending my head to look down the sights. But of course, that requires you to change some pretty major things about your position. So I think what I'm trying to get at is that if you think that changing the heights of your sights will benefit you in a match, you may want to consider how many days you have to practice with a new setup before you shoot that match. For example, if it's a Thursday and my match is on a Saturday, I really only have one day to practice with a new setup, if that. So I may want to consider just sticking with my current setup throughout the days leading up to my match and through the match, and then when I get back to practice on Monday, then I can start changing things with my sights and experimenting with different types of holds. Because at least in my experience, I found that It takes me several practice sessions to get accustomed to a new hold. And you need to practice with the same hold multiple times in order to become consistent. So this just about wraps up my thoughts on using riser blocks. Thank you for watching this video. I know it was very long, but hopefully you found it to be informative. As always, please stay tuned to 10 Meter Tuners for future episodes and content.